The tide is out, and a young man stands ankle-deep in wet sand, watching the horizon. Behind him, his people are loading everything they own onto rafts lashed together from bamboo and vine. Ahead of him, there's nothing. No coastline, no smudge of green on the horizon, no birds circling a distant shore. Just water, all the way to the edge of the world as far as anyone has ever seen it. He's about to get on the raft anyway. Behind him, an older woman checks the lashings on a bundle of dried fish, testing each knot with a tug before she's satisfied. A child clings to her leg, more interested in the crabs scuttling near the waterline than the ocean everyone else keeps staring at. Nobody is celebrating. This isn't a triumphant departure. It's closer to the quiet, focused dread of people checking their gear one last time before doing something they know might not work. 65,000 years later, we'd find his descendants on a continent that shouldn't have been reachable at all, and we still argue about how they got there. That continent is Australia, and the water this man and his people crossed wasn't some narrow strait you could swim if you had to. Even at the lowest point of the Ice Age, when sea levels dropped further than they've ever been in human history, there was still a stretch of open ocean separating Southeast Asia from Australia that no amount of walking could ever close. Some of the shortest crossings still meant over 70 kilometers of deep water. No landmarks, currents strong enough to sweep a raft miles off course, and absolutely no guarantee that anything they'd built would survive contact with open sea. They did it anyway. Not once, but repeatedly. Enough times that a genetically viable population made it across and thrived. To understand why that's almost impossible to explain, you have to understand what this stretch of water actually was. In the 1850s, a naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace was cataloging wildlife across the islands of Southeast Asia when he noticed something strange. Cross one narrow strait, and the animals completely changed. Tigers and elephants on one side. Marsupials and birds found nowhere else on Earth on the other. It was as if two entirely different versions of the natural world had been sitting a few kilometers apart, never mixing, for millions of years. He spent years sailing between islands collecting specimens, and the pattern never broke. Whatever invisible line he'd stumbled onto, it had held firm since long before anything resembling a human ever looked out at that same water. He was looking at what we now call the Wallace Line, and without knowing it, he'd found the edge of an ocean trench too deep and too old to ever close, no matter how far the sea level dropped during an ice age. That's the wall our man on the beach was staring at. Not a channel, not a shortcut, a permanent scar in the ocean floor that had kept two ecosystems apart since before humans existed at all. So how did anyone get across it with nothing but stone tools and rope made from plant fiber? The most straightforward answer is rafts. Bamboo lashed together with vine, built using nothing beyond what any Stone Age toolkit could produce. Modern experimental archaeologists have actually built these rafts from scratch, using stone axes to cut bamboo and hand-twisted fiber for rope, then floated them successfully off the coast of Indonesia. Some even paddled them across real stretches of open water to prove the physics held up. It's a clean, simple explanation, and it doesn't require inventing some lost technology we have no evidence for. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Floating a raft in a calm bay is one thing. Surviving days on open water, exposed to storms, with no fresh water storage and no way to predict the currents, is an entirely different problem. A raft that works in a test doesn't automatically mean people actually crossed 70 kilometers of unpredictable sea on one, especially the first time, with nobody alive who'd ever done it before to tell them what to expect. Some researchers argue it wasn't one heroic crossing at all, but a slow chain of island hops, each one shorter and less deadly than a single open ocean leap. The geography supports this. Scattered islands did sit between Southeast Asia and Australia, like stepping stones, some visible from others on a clear day, some not. But even the shortest gaps in that chain still meant losing sight of land entirely for hours at a stretch, drifting in a current with no way to correct course if it pulled you the wrong way, and it doesn't explain how enough people made the trip, more than once, to avoid the whole population dying out from inbreeding within a few generations. The genetics say multiple successful crossings happened. That's not one lucky raft. That's a working strategy, repeated. There's a third idea, messier and stranger, that some of this happened by accident. Storms sweeping small groups out to sea, who then simply survived long enough to wash up somewhere new. It's not as implausible as it sounds. Ocean currents through this region are powerful and well documented, and there are recorded modern cases, small fishing boats and even lone swimmers, drifting similarly vast distances by pure chance and living to tell about it. But accidental drift doesn't explain the timing, the repetition, or the fact that the people who arrived in Australia came equipped. Tools, knowledge, numbers large enough to immediately start a permanent, thriving population. That doesn't look like a shipwreck. That looks like a plan. Here's what nobody can settle. None of these theories fully hold up alone. What most researchers now suspect is some tangled combination of all three. Deliberate rafts, built with real seafaring knowledge that simply hasn't survived in the archaeological record. Refined over island hop crossings we'll likely never find direct evidence for, because wood and rope don't last 65,000 years in a tropical climate. That's worth sitting with for a second. The absence of physical proof isn't proof of absence. It just means the boats were made of exactly the kind of material that was never going to survive to be found. We're trying to reconstruct a voyage using only the parts of it that happened to be made of stone, when almost everything that actually got them across the water was rope, wood, and knowledge passed mouth to mouth, none of which leaves a fossil. And what happened once they landed tells its own story. Archaeological sites across Australia from this period don't show a handful of desperate survivors clinging to the coast. They show people spreading fast, deep into the continent's interior, adapting to landscapes utterly unlike anything they'd known in Southeast Asia, and doing it within a strikingly short span of time. Sites like Majed Bibi in the north show people making ground-edge tools and using pigment within what is, geologically speaking, no time at all after arrival. That's not the pattern of an accident. That's the pattern of people who knew exactly what they were capable of, and who set about building a life the moment their feet hit new sand. Which leaves an uncomfortable question hanging over how casually we tend to write off the people who came before us. If a group with no writing, no metal, no maps, and no one alive who'd ever survived this crossing before them could organize and repeat something this dangerous, on purpose, what does that say about everything else we've assumed they couldn't do? Maybe the real story was never about the raft at all. Maybe it's about a man standing in the wet sand, staring at a horizon with nothing on it, deciding to get on anyway, and being right. Somewhere behind him, an entire species' capacity for courage was quietly being proven, and nobody there had any idea it was history.